Morning did not break so much as it arrived quietly, filtering through layers of glass as steel high above the restless city below. And when Nilo opened his eyes, he did so with the disorienting sensation of someone who has crossed a border in the night and awakened in foreign territory. The softness of the mattress beneath him almost accusatory, its luxury. The air cool and perfectly regulated rather than thick with dampness and unresolved arguments. And for several long seconds he lay still, staring at the ceiling as memory returned not in fragments, but in full clarity. The rain, the negotiation, Lucien Vale's steady gaze, and the finality, but door closing behind him. He rose slowly from the bed, bare feet meeting polished flooring that did not creak in protests as the boards in his father's house always had. And he moved toward the window, where the skyline stretched outward in disciplined geometry. The storm reduced to faint traces of moisture clinging to glass, and in the reflection he saw himself, as if from a distance, a 24-year-old man with a lean, fully grown frame, narrow, but defined shoulders, a clean jawline sharpened by quiet endurance, subtle cheekbones casting faint shadows beneath steady dark eyes that held awareness rather than innocence. His black hair slightly tousled from sleep yet falling with natural weight across his forehead, not fragile, not boyish, but undeniably adult, and standing in a place that did not yet know what to make of him. There was a knock at the door then, precise and measured, and before he could respond it opened to admit a woman whose composure suggested both professionalism and long familiarity with power. Her attire immaculate, her posture straight, not from fear but from discipline. And she informed him, in a calm, neutral tone, that breakfast had been prepared and that Mr. Vale expected him at the dining area whenever he was ready. The phrasing careful, respectful, neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging that he now occupied a role within this household whether he fully understood it or not. The corridors he walked through felt less like passageways and more like statements of intent. The architecture deliberate in its clean lines and muted tones, security present yet seamlessly integrated into design, cameras discreet but unmistakable, doors reinforced in ways that spoke of protection rather than imprisonment. And Nilo became increasingly aware that this penthouse was not merely a residence, but an extension of Lucien himself, controlled, strategic, impenetrable. Lucien was already seated when Nilo entered the dining space, positioned at the head of a long table crafted from dark wood polished to reflected perfection, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed molded to his tall frame, his sharp jawline defined beneath the morning light and his jet black hair arranged with effortless precision. Near black eyes lifting briefly in acknowledgement before returning to the tablet resting against his hand, as though this meeting were not extraordinary but scheduled, expected, inevitable. There was no theatrical tension, no overt display of dominance, yet the gravity of his presence filled the room with a restrained authority that required no reinforcement. And Nilo took the seat opposite him with measured composure, aware of the deliberate distance between them and the unspoken implications of proximity. Lucien spoke without raising his voice, his tone even and controlled, as he explained that legal arrangements would be finalized within days, that public recognition of their union would occur strategically and without unnecessary spectacle, that Nilo would attend specific events and require, though would otherwise be free within the confines of the residence, and that no expectations beyond presence and discretion would be imposed upon him. The language precise and devoid of sentiment yet layered with intention. When he stated calmly that there would be no obligation to produce heirs and that Nilo's condition had been the foundation rather than the flaw of the agreement, the word settled, not as accusation, but as confirmation of a truth already acknowledged. And Nilo felt the peculiar weight of being valued for absence rather than potential, a reversal so disorienting that it left him momentarily silent, his gaze steady though his pulse betrayed the subtle tension beneath his controlled exterior. Lucien observed him then with that same unwavering steadiness, and added almost quietly, a consent would govern all physical boundaries, that nothing would be demanded without explicit agreement, and that protection under his name was neither temporary nor conditional. A declaration delivered without flourish yet carrying the unmistakable implication that to be under Lucien Vale's protection was to be removed from harm in ways both visible and unseen. The conversation might have ended there, suspended in composed civility, had a familiar soft sound not drifted into the space, a small, inquisitive mew that drew both their attention toward the entrance, where the black kitten from the previous night appeared with unsteady confidence, its fur now dry and faintly glossy beneath the light, green eyes alert and curious as it padded across the expansive floor toward Lucien without hesitation. The shift in Lucien's posture was subtle yet undeniable as he lowered the tablet and extended a hand, allowing the kitten to brush against his fingers before lifting it with careful support. The formidable lines of his face softening almost imperceptibly as the small creature nestled against his chest. And Nilo watched with quiet astonishment as the man whose authority commanded silence across entire rooms adjusted his hold to ensure the kitten's comfort. "It will remain," Lucien stated simply, as though the decision required no further justification. And in that understated assertion lay something that unsettled Nilo far more than any threat could have, because permanence in Lucien's world did not occur accidentally. As breakfast continued, in measured silence punctuated only by the faint purring of the kitten and the distant hum of the city far below, Nilo became aware of a subtle recalibration within himself, or recognition that this arrangement, forged in logic and sealed in rain, was unfolding not as a cage but as a structure with rules he did not yet fully understand, and that the danger here did not lie in cruelty or force but in the slow, deliberate weaving of connection under the guise of contract. By the time Lucien rose from his seat with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to command, instructing that Nilo would be introduced to security protocols and the internal staff by afternoon, the boundaries of this new life had begun to take form. Not walls closing in, but parameters expanding outward under careful supervision, and as the door closed behind him and the space settled once more into refined stillness, Nilo stood alone beside the long table, the faint echo of Lucien's presence lingering like a mark pressed into stone. He understood then, with growing clarity, that episode 1 had been about transaction, about reign and surrender and the cold logic of inheritance, but episode 2 was something more intricate, more deliberate, the quiet drafting of coexistence between two men bound not by expectation of legacy, but by mutual awareness what had been denied them elsewhere. And that within the polished walls of this penthouse fortress, the most dangerous element was not control, nor wealth, nor even power, but the possibility that protection, once accepted, might begin to feel indistinguishable from belonging. As the door closed behind Lucien and the room settled into a silence so refined it felt curated, Nilo remained standing where he was for several moments, aware that the stillness here was not emptiness, a containment, a carefully engineered pause between movements in a life that operated according to schedules he had not yet been permitted to see. And though he had been told he was free within the residence, he understood instinctively that freedom inside a fortress was never quite the same as freedom in the open air. The housekeeper returned shortly after to guide him through the penthouse's internal structure, and as they moved from one wing to another he observed details with quiet attentiveness: the reinforced glass layered subtly within panoramic windows, the biometric locks embedded discreetly into door frames, the private elevator accessible only through coded clearance, and the security room positioned not centrally, but slightly off-axis, as though its presence were both strategic and deliberately understated. And with each revelation, he became increasingly aware that Lucien Vale did not merely live above the city, but above threat itself, or at least above visible threat. He was introduced to a small number of staff, each one composed, efficient, and curiously devoid of intrusive curiosity, their gazes respectful, but never lingering, as though they had already been informed of his position and had accepted it without question. And Nilo sensed that acceptance here did not stem from approval, but from loyalty to Lucien, a loyalty that required no explanation beyond instruction. By midday he found himself alone once more, seated near the expansive windows with the black kitten curled against his thigh, its small body radiating warmth through the fabric of his trousers, and he allowed his fingers to trace absently along its spine as his thoughts drifted toward the unfamiliar shape his life had taken in less than 24 hours. The memory of his father's trembling hands and desperate eyes already beginning to feel distant, like a chapter closed not by resolution, but by replacement. It was the subtle vibration of his phone against the glass table beside him that shattered the fragile calm. He stared at it for a long second before answering, already recognizing the number. His father's voice came through strained and low, stripped of drunken bravado and replaced by something closer to panic. And though the words were rushed and fragmented, the meaning emerged clearly enough. Men had come asking questions, not about debt, but about Lucien, about why the heirless Alpha had chosen that particular Omega, about whether the arrangement had been publicized yet. Nilo's spine straightened as a chill moved through him, because this was not idle curiosity, a calculation. And he understood suddenly, at Lucien's decision, had not gone unnoticed within whatever network of influence operated beneath the polished surface of the city. When the call ended, the silence in the penthouse felt different, less curated and more anticipatory, and he became aware that protection was not merely about shielding him from his father's creditors, but from something far larger and more deliberate. Lucien returned earlier than expected. There was no visible sign of urgency in his stride, yet something in the measured precision of his movements suggested awareness, as though he had sensed the shift in atmosphere before stepping through the door. And his gaze found Nilo almost immediately, assessing without accusation. "You received a call," Lucien stated rather than asked. Nilo did not pretend ignorance. "Yes." A pause followed, heavy but not hostile, and Lucien crossed the space between them with unhurried confidence, stopping just close enough for proximity to register without intrusion the faint scent of rain and expensive cologne lingering in the air between them. "They will test the perimeter," Lucien said calmly, his voice low and even, "to determine whether this union alters the balance of power." The words were clinical, yet beneath them lay something unmistakable, vigilance sharpened to a blade's edge. "Am I leverage?" Nilo asked, the question steady despite the tightening in his chest. Lucien's near black eyes held his for a prolonged moment before answering. "No," he replied quietly. "You are a variable." The distinction mattered. Outside, clouds gathered again, not in violent formation, but in slow accumulation, as though the sky itself were mirroring the unseen movements beneath the city's surface. And Nilo realized that his arrival here had not merely settled a debt but shifted something within Lucien's carefully maintained equilibrium. By evening, additional security protocols had been enacted, subtle adjustments invisible to the untrained eye yet unmistakable to someone observant, the elevator requiring dual authorization. Perimeter patrols increased, encrypted communications flashing briefly across screens in the security room, and through it all Lucien remained composed, issuing directives with quiet authority that required no repetition. At one point, as twilight bled into night and the city lights flickered on below, Nilo found himself standing beside Lucien near the expansive window, both men gazing outward at the skyline that concealed more than it revealed. And though neither spoke for several moments, the shared silence felt less strained than before, as though proximity had begun to normalize in the wake of shared awareness. "You may leave," Lucien said suddenly, his tone measured. "If this becomes burdensome." Nilo turned slightly, studying the sharp line of Lucien's profile illuminated by distant lightning, the controlled stillness in his posture, the absence of coercion in his offer. And he understood that the statement was genuine, but departure would not erase what had already shifted. "And return where?" Nilo asked quietly. Lucien did not answer immediately, and in that pause lay acknowledgement. The first crack of thunder rolled across the city shortly thereafter, distant but resonant, and almost simultaneously the lights within the penthouse flickered, not a full outage, not dramatic enough to signal failure, but long enough to signal interference. Every screen in the security room lit up at once. A breach attempt, not successful, but deliberate. Lucien's expression did not change, yet the temperature of the room seemed to drop as he turned toward the corridor with controlled urgency, issuing quiet instructions through an earpiece Nilo had not noticed before, his voice steady and precise. And for the first time, Nilo witnessed the full extension of the power that had seemed so abstract the night before. This was not a businessman protecting assets. This was a strategist responding to provocation. The kitten, startled by the distant thunder, pressed closer against Nilo's leg, and he instinctively lifted it, holding the small trembling body against his chest as alarms muted almost as quickly as they had activated. The breach repelled, but the message unmistakable. Someone had noticed, someone had tested, and someone would try again. When Lucien returned several minutes later, his composure restored to its usual unshakable state, he paused a short distance from Nilo and regarded him with that same penetrating steadiness that had altered the course of his life in the rain. "It begins sooner than anticipated," Lucien said quietly. Nilo met his gaze without flinching. "Then I suppose," he replied, after a measured breath, "we should not pretend this is merely residence anymore." A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched Lucien's expression, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but recognition. Outside, the storm broke fully at last, rain striking glass in relentless sheets, the city below blurring into streaks of light and shadow. And within the controlled silence of the penthouse fortress, two figures stood at the threshold of something no longer defined solely by contract or calculation, but by shared awareness of the forces now moving against them. And far below, unseen from their vantage point. A black vehicle idled in the rain across the street, its tinted windows concealing the figure inside who watched the illuminated top floor with patient interest. A phone pressed to his ear as he murmured that confirmation had been obtained, that the heirless Alpha had indeed taken a spouse, and that the absence of heirs might prove far more destabilizing than anyone had predicted. The engine remained running. The rain did not let up, and high above the city, unaware of the precise shape of the threat but fully aware of its existence, Nilo stood beside Lucien Vale as the first true move in a far larger game was quietly set into motion.